Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Jazmin Aguilera. In the U.S., there's no one front line of the war on drugs. That's because the so-called war is just about everywhere. Between addiction disorders and overdoses, it's pretty obvious the way drugs are hurting American communities. But the war itself is also hurting us. The Boston Globe Spotlight team has a new 5-part investigative podcast series called Snitch City. The podcast looks at police use of confidential informants in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and the ways this whole informant system preys on vulnerable people and seems to invite police corruption.
The CI system is based on blind trust and can have deadly consequences.
It is shadowy.
Things just had gotten to the point of no control.
It is underground.
The corruption level was just off the hook. It really was.
I'm in the Globe studio catching up with 2 Spotlight reporters who have been working on this story. Dugan Arnett, who hosts the podcast, and his reporting partner, Andrew Ryan. Welcome, Dugan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Welcome, Andrew.
Great to be here.
So let's start off at the very beginning here. Can you describe to me, Dugan, what a confidential informant is and how they're used to make arrests?
I think probably the simplest way to put it is I'm Dugan. I get pulled over. I've got a small amount of drugs on me. An officer says, hey, we can make this case go away, but we need something in return. And what we need is information. So who'd you get the drugs from? Who's selling drugs, et cetera. I'm now in this pact. No contract. There's no real rules of engagement, I would say. And I'm now working for the police to get them information in order to save myself.
Often the people who are involved in these cases are folks, who are struggling with addiction and vulnerable populations. And how it translates is it means that, that there will be a confidential informant who provides information, and then we'll do essentially a series of undercover buys for the police. And all of this stuff happens outside of the view of lawyers or the courts. It's just, as Dugan said, a pact between essentially a police officer and their informant or their, the person that they caught with drugs or a gun or something like that.
So let's talk about New Bedford, Massachusetts. Dugan, your reporting starts there. What brought you to New Bedford?
Yeah, so this was about 2022, I think, and I was in the office one day, got an email, the subject line of which was just, I need help, ! And it was a little hard to follow. It was an email from a woman who was sort of explaining that I got involved with a New Bedford detective who then started investigating my fiance for heroin trafficking. And from there, sort of everything went off the rails. And so it was one of those things where, I just happened to have a couple of minutes free. I was waiting for an edit or something like that and ended up calling this woman, and she lays this story out, and it's even wilder than the email. It sounds so far-fetched that it was one of those things where you're sort of like, this is a lovely, wild, ridiculous story, but you have some doubts about whether it's true. And then she starts providing some documents, and she starts providing some screenshots from her phone. And as she does that, this wild story just kind of comes together, and you realize that this is an actual thing that happened. And that story published, maybe, a few months later. And then from there, sort of the floodgates opened. It was just tips from New Bedford about how New Bedford police had been abusing informants, manipulating the informant system. And it was sort of, for lack of a better term, off to the races.
So you both reported a lot of shady police behavior, especially with informants in New Bedford. There's police sleeping with informants, coaching informants, misusing informants and search warrants, and putting their safety at risk. Dugan, can you talk to me about one of these cases that you think really illustrates the problem?
Yeah. So the podcast starts with a story that, again, seemed pretty far-fetched the first time I heard it. It's involves an officer named George Santos, who one night, under the cover of darkness, boards this fishing boat in the port of New Bedford. And, this boat is filled with some fishermen who are getting ready to leave the next morning on a fishing trip. He shows up, gun on his hip, dressed in black, off duty, bloodshot eyes, according to one member of the crew, and he starts demanding drugs. So the fishermen are asking why this guy is on the boat, and his response is, a CI, a confidential informant, told me that you have drugs on this boat, and that's why I'm here. And that phrase for police is like a hall pass. They can do, if not anything they want, at least close, simply by citing a confidential informant. I have a confidential informant who told me XYZ, so now I can search your car, your boat.
So in the example with this boat and with Officer Santos, I think it's a symptoms of basically a police officer being emboldened by the secrecy of this system. Because what we found is when officers are even supposedly operating within the kind of the guidelines of their department, we found examples of pretty egregious misconduct, of falsely attributing information to a confidential informant to get a warrant. Officers who have acknowledged coaching informants, telling them to miss court, telling them to buy drugs for themselves for their own personal use.
To lie in court.
Yeah, to lie in court. And the flip side, we found example after example of police officers who have been found to have lied in court, who still get this blind trust to be able to say, I have this confidential informant who's telling me all this, so just believe me and trust me and let me, go search someone's car or someone's boat or someone's phone.
So, Andrew, what is it about the informant system that makes it so ripe for corruption?
I think what makes it so ripe for corruption is the fact that there's no checks and balances. So these things are all done within the police department and there's no outside oversight. Police say they do their own internal audits. They won't provide them to us or anyone else. Many of the large departments won't provide basic information about how many informants they have, how much money they're paying the informants, how many informants have been accused of misconduct, how many officers have been accused of misconduct with informants. So it is the ultimate black box.
So it seems like once these informants sign into this role, they're basically screwed. This whole system is such a black box. There's no one that can help them once they're in it. So if things go sideways with the police, they can't complain to their friends because then they might be implicated in their informing. They can't go to the police, obviously. So are CIs basically always the losers in this arrangement?
It's hard to say that there aren't arrangements that work the way they should, which is, a sort of a agreed upon quid pro quo. You do this for me, this one case, we'll make your case go away. That's the end of it. But what I think happens much more frequently is that informants begin to feel stuck because they thought they were signing on for one thing, and then the calls keep coming from police. The police want more information. They're afraid to say no because they could go to jail. They're worried that their cases could come back, that the police could out them, and then they're just in this horrible catch-22. So there's one former confidential informant that we talked to. He's in the podcast in episode 2. His pseudonym that we used is Daniel. He thought he was going to help police seize one gun, and then that became more and more and more and more and more. And hearing the way he sort of felt trapped over the course of months, this became a months-long thing where he's afraid to tell them no. He's afraid of being outed. And so he's living like the way he describes it as sort of this double life where every so often he gets a call from police and it feels like he's got to look around and decide who am I going to essentially set up. His story is uniquely disturbing, as you'll hear if you listen to the podcast. But that hamster wheel nature, it's like you get on a hamster wheel and then you just can't get off. And I think that that's the case, not just for Daniel, but other informants who we spoke to as well describe it the very same way.
More of my conversation on the Boston Globe's Snitch City investigation after a short break. So, Andrew, you've done a lot of data reporting on the use of informants broadly. What have you learned?
What we've learned is in Massachusetts, nearly 9 out of 10 drug raids are based on the word of a confidential informant. And we learned this by literally going page by page through 2,000 search warrants from courts across the Commonwealth. And we got that number because we wanted to put it in context. We wanted to see how widespread informant use was in these cases. And what we found was that New Bedford not only matched that state average, but it exceeded it. In New Bedford, it was 99% of warrants were based on confidential informants. I mean, there are certain places where there are other kinds of drug cases, things with drug dogs, especially at Logan Airport. But by and large, confidential informants are the lifeblood of drug raids in the Commonwealth and, quite frankly, across the nation.
Hopefully this isn't too far. There's no drug war in New Bedford or Massachusetts without confidential informants. I think that's fair to say.
So, Dugan, in the very opening of Snitch City, you say that police departments are addicted to using confidential informants in the war on drugs. That's a particularly strong word. Tell me why the CI system is used so much, especially when it comes to drug busts.
Because it's easy, I think. It's easy for a drug cop to say, hey, I have a confidential informant who told me this. When you think about the other ways that police sort of go about investigations, take, undercover work. Like, these are lengthy operations. They're dangerous. They're time-consuming. They're costly. It's much easier to pull over a kid who's got some drugs and essentially put him to work for you. You do that 10 times, you got 10 people working for you, you've got your own little sort of
pyramid scheme.
Yeah. It's not a bad analogy.
Yeah. So using the informants, the ease of it, the lack of transparency, lack of accountability, the fact that it's used 9 out of 10 times, do you think it's crowding out other, maybe more ethical ways of combating drug trafficking?
These are hard cases to make. Another method is undercover work. And there is some argument. I mean, one of the people that we interviewed down in Florida is a lawyer who helped write confidential informant law down there that was passed. And he calls informants, basically, he doesn't call them informants. What's the word he uses?
Civilian operatives. He was a great quote. One of my favorites was we don't trust civilians to direct traffic at a football game, yet we're going to send them into some of the most dangerous places in any given city alone, without protection, to do the work of police.
Right. Your show does a great job of outlining the ways that this system can be problematic. But are there ways that it does actually work?
I mean, it certainly is a successful way to get a search warrant approved. That, the record showed, undoubtedly. A search warrant is issued, and then police have to file it back to the court and file what's called a return. And a return lists exactly what was taken. And we spent a lot of time looking at returns, and sometimes they got stuff. Other times, not so much. Sometimes, nothing at all. But what gets lost is it's not like there's any public keeping of a scorecard for an informant. All informants are referred to as reliable, which is important for legal reasons. But by and large, there's not a whole lot of measure of that reliability. And, we've done our best to try to trace individual informants in their different cases, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But it doesn't mean that they don't get used in the next one.
One of the most interesting conversations I think I had in this whole process was with a one-time informant in New Bedford. And he was essentially a mid-level drug dealer. And what he says he did was he would, in exchange for being able to deal drugs with impunity, not be hassled by the police, he would set up lower-level dealers. So he would essentially drop off drugs, let his police handler know this is where the drugs are going to be, and within hours, police would be there raiding the house. Now, the problem with that is that in any normal definition of the war on drugs, you clearly want to be going up the food chain. You want to be flipping a dealer for a supplier. But this was like the opposite way. What this guy was describing is essentially allowing the drug war or allowing drug dealing to sort of keep going with, while also, I guess, and what the police are getting out of this is that they're making sizable, significant busts that look good on paper, that allow them to hold press conferences and put out press releases saying, hey, look at what we're doing, when in actuality, nothing is really happening.
I'm struck here. You say so yourself in the podcast that the informants, they broke the law. It's not like they're innocent people completely. And there are some people you name in your stories who say that the informants in your stories are not credible sources. And yet the police themselves say that they're reliable. They have to legally. How do you square that?
It's a great irony. And, Andrew and I have talked about this quite a bit. You take this.
So, as we mentioned, we read a ton of search warrants. And in New Bedford in particular, one of the lines that was in warrant after warrant, and a lot of these warrants, they look like cut and paste jobs, and they just fill in the names and some specifics. But one line that is always there is, I know this person is credible or reliable because they acknowledge to me that they are involved in criminal activity. So it's basically saying, I know they're trustworthy because they're criminals. And so therefore, I can trust their word in this search warrant.
And yet they turn around and look at this reporting and say, you can't trust those people.
Correct.
These are the same, some of the same criminals that they're blaming us for, relying upon are the same ones that they would rely upon to obtain the search warrants that allow them to do their jobs.
I feel like these things have become, just because of television police shows, that you see search warrants all the time. But a search warrant's a big deal. Like it allows law enforcement to set aside, part of the Bill of Rights. Like, the right against unwarranted search and seizure is a big deal in this country, or it should be.
Yeah, you got to bug a judge to sign a document for that. And it's not easy.
Or a clerk magistrate.
Oh, yeah. Or a clerk magistrate. There are other cases that have happened over the years where nonviolent drug offenders or first-time offenders, the kind of people who aren't usually in the system, getting coerced into becoming informants. There's a case like Rachel Hoffman in Florida who was arrested for possession of marijuana and ecstasy back in 2008. And while she was trying to do a controlled buy with a wire, she was discovered and ultimately killed. If something like that, a beautiful college student with practically no priors, not somebody who's in this world, can get caught up like this, if something this obvious doesn't stop or reform the system, will anything?
It's a great question.
And we drove down the road where her body was found outside Tallahassee. And I think that anytime you have things that trigger laws to be named after people. In Florida, they passed something called Rachel's Law, which isn't perfect, but it put in some protections in place, which included, police had to keep in mind the safety of the informant, that the informant can access a lawyer if requested. In California, it was Chad's Law, which sets up some kind of age restrictions around the use of informants. But there have been tragedies here in Massachusetts. In February of 1988, there was a drug raid at an apartment in Dorchester that was based on a confidential informant that ended up not existing, and a police officer was killed. Boston was home to Whitey Bulger, who served as a informant for the FBI. And obviously we now know that he was playing both sides, and lots of people were hurt and killed because of that.
And yet, despite those cases, we don't have laws here in Massachusetts at all protecting informants.
No.
You think about the case at UMass Amherst, where there was a college student who, same sort of thing, was caught with some drugs, was recruited to become an informant. University didn't tell his parents. It was kept hush-hush, and he ended up dying of an overdose while working as an informant. And the university did stop the use of students as informants, but yeah, there was no triggering of any sort of larger look at the informant system in Massachusetts, who were using as informants, that sort of a thing.
So you say at the beginning of your podcast that no one in the system wants the information to get out, certainly not the police, but also the informants themselves. Andrew, how do you report on a policing system that is, by its very nature, a secret?
That's a great question. I mean, we try to use all the different tools that we have as reporters. I mean, we file a lot of records requests. And quite frankly, a lot of those get ignored, particularly here in Boston. We, work our own sources. We dig through court records. We, talk to people on the street. It often feels like you're building a little bit of a brick wall and you take a piece from here, a piece from there, but it's never one thing often. It's a series of things, and sometimes you'll get some breakthrough person who has firsthand knowledge of something or some document that kind of lays some things out. But it ends up being this kind of tedious process of kind of slowly building the foundation.
Dugan, I had this thought while I was listening to this podcast that one of the people featured in your reporting is a man you called Daniel, who was himself a confidential informant. He's now in jail for unrelated crimes, but he's extremely scared that his identity as a CI will get out and he'll be hurt or killed in jail. He literally calls you crying for help at one point.
I'm so stressed out, Dugan. I mean, you're the only number I can call. I'm so stressed out.
Can you tell me what's going on?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me, Dugan?
And I know you used a voice actor to portray him, but I guess there are enough details about him that somebody who really wants to know about this community and try to figure it out could probably get pretty far doing that. Do you worry about your responsibility in protecting him?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we had lots and lots and lots of conversations about how to protect him in every way possible, while maintaining the broad strokes of the story. And these conversations a lot of times went up until publication. Are there certain details that we can take out, that we can vague up, that we can leave out in an effort to make it as difficult as possible for anyone who doesn't already know his story, which there are some that do, to sort of limit that.
What would you say to somebody if you were trying to convince them to talk to you, who was scared about how vulnerable it would make them?
Well, there was a lot of conversations like that in this story, and the nature of it is so sensitive, and there's risks involved on all sides. And the pitch usually was, here's why we think, here's why we think that your story is important. And with Daniel, there was a lot of stuff in documents that sort of laid out that story. But by hearing from him and from some other informants who will appear later in the podcast, the hope was that this humanizes these people. It's one thing to sort of hear the word confidential informant and brush that off. Hearing how this system has impacted and affected people on a daily basis in their current lives is something that hopefully makes people, listeners, readers, lawmakers, think a little bit harder about this system and what it's doing, and if it's doing it the right way.
Since all of this reporting has come to light, have you had any response from the police department or the city of New Bedford?
Dugan began digging into this story in 2022, and we looked this up today because it matters. He first requested an interview with the New Bedford police chief regarding their use of confidential informants on August 10th of 2022, which is 951 days ago. As we reported this story and then prepared to publish, we requested interviews with the mayor, with the police chief, with several police officers. We sent them emails. We knocked on the doors of their homes. Dugan and I showed up in the mayor's office in New Bedford when they didn't respond, saying, "We'd like to see the mayor now, please." And they said he was there, but he wouldn't see us. And they released a series of kind of short statements leading up to publication. And then after we published, they posted what they said was a series of kind of point-by-point rebuttals on the city's website. Now, we've gone through that because we take all these things really seriously. I mean, accuracy is our main thing. And what we found was that much of what they said was either already included in our reporting. Some of it was wrong. They claimed that they had given us a document which they hadn't given us. They've subsequently given it to us, and it backed up our reporting. So they have not engaged with us directly, despite us trying to sit down to talk to them about this issue, again, going back 951 days. But they have, put word out on their own, and that's fine. But we would still love to sit down with the mayor and talk to the mayor about this. We would love to sit down with the police chief and talk to the police chief about this. We'd love to sit down with all the police officers that we called and that we emailed and talk to them about this system because it matters.
And last question, I'm going to start with you, Andrew, and then go to you, Dugan, but the same question. Do you have any hope that this reporting will lead to some changes in the police use of informants in Massachusetts?
I hope so, but I'm not optimistic.
What about you, Dugan?
I'd say the same. Again, so many things had to sort of go right in order to pierce this veil of secrecy in New Bedford. And New Bedford, I think if you listen to the podcast or read the series, is sort of a poster child for informant abuse and how easy it is to manipulate that system. And it's just hard for me to imagine, especially based on what the city has said in response to the coverage, that they'll take this seriously in any real way and give it an honest look. And if they're not going to do it.
I mean, one thing I would add is that we do have more coming. So we have more stories that, we're pushing towards publication, not just about New Bedford, but about places across the state. So there's definitely more that we're going to report about this. But also, I understand the use of confidential informants, and I understand why they can be such an important tool. What I don't understand is anything that operates entirely contained by one agency, shrouded in complete secrecy. I think there's a way that you can be transparent and you can be fair and you can put checks and balances and controls in the system and still protect people who provide information.
Dugan Arnett and Andrew Ryan are investigative reporters for the Globe Spotlight team. Thank you both for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
And you can find links to the Snitch City reporting project in our show notes. Subscribe to both Say More and Snitch City from the Boston Globe, wherever you get your podcasts. Say More is a production of the Boston Globe. Today's episode was produced by Anna Kuzmer. Our editor is Jim Dow. Our engineer is Uzair Ahmed. If you like the show, please follow us and leave a review. You can email us at saymore@globe.com. I'm Jazmin Aguilera. Thanks for listening.